Hi, I'm Danica Tormohlen, VP of Group Content with Informa Connect, reporting for TSNN. And I'm joined by Carole and Florent from Stax. And they just put together a list of the top 20 show organizers by 2023 revenue. And we wanted to chat with them a little bit about the list. First off, how long has AMR and Stax? AMR used to be a separate company and it was acquired by Stax a few years ago. Give us some history on the list.
So the first edition of the Stax Top 20 was actually called AMR Top 20 because at the time we were AMR. And I believe that was in 2016, quite a while ago.
Tell us a little bit about the criteria you use to rank the exhibition organizers, especially for companies that are not publicly traded. Of course, the ones that are publicly traded, you can look at their numbers, although you do have to break out some of the non-exhibition revenue. So we should clarify this is only exhibition revenue.
Yeah, so exactly, as you pointed out, unlike other rankings out there, this one is really looking at exhibition organizing revenue only. So you'll see that a lot of organizers have a venue rental revenue that is part of their overall revenue. So we're really breaking it down and looking at exhibitions organizing revenue only. For the publicly traded ones, it is a somewhat straightforward exercise as all the data is out there publicly available, although there is also some methodology that is applied in some instances because we still need to tally up certain numbers, but it's a more straightforward exercise. For the non-publicly traded ones, it's a mixture of different things, really. As a consultancy, we have our own pipeline of projects with access to some data that is very helpful as part of projects, but also being experts in that industry. We also have a lot of conversations with industry veterans and main players in the industry. And then there is secondary research, as well as our efforts on Globex, our annual publication on the global exhibitions industry. And as part of that, we look at main organizers as well. That plus the annual reports, when you combine that overall, we get to a very good view of what exhibition organizing revenue is for the top players.
I can also add that even on public companies, even if they do break it down by exhibition revenue, we know that number is not always correct because there'll be other revenues which should count, and within that revenues that we should take out because of how they look at things slightly different to us. So if I take the example of GL events, actually they do have exhibition organizing revenue which sits under a different business unit than GL events exhibitions, and so you wouldn't guess that. We know that, and so therefore we then correct the publicly available information, ensure that it's agreed by the organizer to provide a more accurate view. And the whole point was to be able to benchmark and compare organizers on apples for apples, because there's no such ranking before then. And we were being asked the question as to, am I number 3 or 5 or 6? I really don't know, because if I look at my peers, in fact, they have a different business model, and I need to compare where I sit.
Good points. It is a valuable resource that isn't out there anywhere else. We talked right before we jumped on that you don't provide the actual numbers. You have a chart with a range you can tell in there, but how do you check that data and make sure that it is accurate? We talked about the fact that you send it out to the organizers and ask them to review it. And so tell us about that.
Yeah, so because we want to be accurate for one, and two, it has become really an important ranking out there. We really want to make sure that it is as accurate as possible. It actually involves a reaching out to all the organizers before publishing the ranking. We reach out to all the organizers and make sure that we have their green light as to whether the numbers are accurate or not. And some of them give us a range or give us an indication that, yes, we are very close to the actual figures. Others give us the exact figures. But the compromise here is that we then publish the chart without the figures next to it, because to maintain some sort of confidentiality.
You also mentioned that you take out the event services revenue and some of the venue rental revenue. And for those in the US, those are, I'm assuming that's for the messes that also are buildings that produce their own events, which isn't like the business model in the US. So they would have other revenues that come from event services. So just the events they organize is what you're measuring, right?
Yeah, so it really includes only the revenue that is tied to a specific event that is organized by the organizer, if that makes sense. The exhibition's organizing revenue contains NSM sales, but also digital revenue, sponsorship revenue that is directly linked to an exhibition, as well as ticketing, for instance.
So yes, I would say British or American organizers understand those numbers. When we first launched that, it was not understood or accepted very well in Germany, for example, because they look at their numbers as everything. Say we do 1 billion, and then you're telling the world we do only 200,000. That's incorrect. And so there was a lot of education needed to say both are correct. It's different ways of looking at the world, and this is also a useful way. We're not saying it replaces any other way, but it's a useful complement. And so it took a bit of time for that to sink in and be seen as useful. But now it is, and we know some German organizers for whom it is on the wall, and they want to go up the ranking. So it took a little while for some to understand the value of this, but we're happy now that it's become an industry standard, really.
Thank you for laying the groundwork there of how you put the list together and a little bit behind the numbers. So let's dive into the data that you just released. What are the main drivers behind that 47% increase in revenue by those top 20 in 2023? Besides acquisitions, what are some of the other key factors that are pushing this substantial growth in the numbers on the list this year?
I would say acquisitions is a big one, but you'd also have the return of the Chinese market. So by Chinese market, I don't necessarily mean only China itself, but Chinese participants going to Chinese exhibitions as well as in neighboring countries. So that recovery, I believe that the restrictions on social gatherings were lifted end of 2022. So the real recovery post-COVID came in 23, which is the year that we looked at. So that would all have also significantly bumped the market size.
An impact on the rankings, because some of the organizers who were fairly exposed to China, take Clarion, for example, then shot up the rank, so had a stronger progress in 23 compared to 22 than others. If you take an Easy Fairs, for example, who had a much stronger 21 to 22 than 22 to 23 relative to others, because they don't have the China exposure. So that explains as well some of the ranking changes there, even if from a pure like for comparison, then that would be somewhat different.
That is helpful. So the Chinese market you're talking about from the exhibitor perspective and the attendee perspective, and also the organizers or the exhibitions themselves that are in the Chinese market. So all those three kind of went up, driving some of that growth.
Yeah, exactly.
Some of the European organizers you pointed out experienced slower growth due to biennial show cycles. Do you see this trend reversing, for instance, on those other years? Like next year, is it some of those that had those biennial show cycles get bumped back up on the list? What do you think?
Yeah, exactly. So there is a biennial effect, but it really is dependent on the events calendar of specific organizers. So we talked about Messen. A lot of the German Messen have biennial, if not triennial, exhibition cycles, and therefore that has an impact on their ranking year on year. But because it doesn't change within their calendar. So if one year in an even year, they're very strong, and the following year they're somewhat less strong because of that biennial fluctuation, it remains stable within the organizer. So the following year I don't know if I'm explaining it correctly, or clearly, but yeah, it's cyclical within an organizer, but it's not going to radically change.
Yeah, those are just shows that are on the calendar every 2 years or every 3 years, and it just impacts the revenue.
Yeah, if you take, for instance, Bauma, which is it is the biggest German show. It's a triennial show, so it happens every 3 years, and it is owned by Messe Munich. and therefore massive revenue sees fluctuations because of that big show. Not only because it also has other biennial events, but yeah, there is some cyclicality, but it really is at the organizer level.
With Informa's acquisition of Essential, how do you anticipate next year's rankings changing? Because obviously they're on the list this year and have been on the list. Are there other potential mergers or market trends you're watching that might impact the industry landscape? Curious from your expert view.
Informa is already top one, first on the list, and Essential acquisition will only reinforce that. So what we'll see, and what we have seen over time already, is really a consolidation at the top, and the first 2, 3 really pulling away from the rest. That has already been a trend over time, and it's only reinforced now. So as you rightly mentioned, the Essential acquisition is going to pull Informa, but even further on, and consolidate its position as the leader.
There's ongoing M&A anyway. So when you look at the longer tail within the top 20, the many organizers are close to each other. And so that's where chunky acquisitions make a difference, of course. So we know there are organizers who are on the acquisition trail. It's not just Informa. We know Clarion is, Closer Still is, and we know Easy Fares now has, with new owners, will be on the acquisition trail as well. So we're expecting further change driven by chunkier acquisitions, because there's still a few businesses out there with substantial revenue which are likely to come to market in the next 12 months. Now, next year's ranking will be based on 2024 activity. So Essential, yes, that should be closed if things go well. Should be closed, I think, in October. So that should feature. Some of the other chunky acquisitions that we see looming are likely to be more in 25 than in 24. But
also the Essential acquisition will, because Essential is also part of the top 20, it will obviously leave room for a new entrant into the top 20 as well. So that consolidation piece not only provides bumps into a specific organizer, but it also opens the floor to other entrants coming into the top 20. But yeah, it has that double effect.
Let's look at Closer Still and DMG events made significant gains this year. What are the underlying factors that contributed to their revenue growth, and do you expect them to continue their upward momentum?
I was actually trying to get to that answer myself, and I could, unless they just really had a strong year. I was looking at M&A activity, etc., at least for DMG, and I couldn't really see anything. I don't know if, Florent, you have a more informed answer on that, but yeah, it is a good question.
I answer Closer Still. So Closer Still acquired UKI last year. So that was, at their scale, that was a meaningful acquisition there. And Closer Still has been growing strongly for a while. So I think that 23 was a very strong year. And when you look at organizers performing the benchmark on growth in 2023, you have Easy Fares, you have Closer Still, who were above the rest of the pack from pure organic growth, excluding acquisitions, excluding China effect. So I think that those two will contribute to Closer Still. So their growth trajectory, they're very aggressive there, and then acquisitions, which are a new thing for them. DMG, I can't really comment as to anything beyond just organic growth and return of some of their big shows being successful.
When you say organic growth, so is that mostly geo-cloning of events into new markets, for instance, with Closer Still?
I think in 2023, you have two effects. You have continuation of COVID recovery. So you also have that, which is returning to 2019 levels, let's say broadly, or exceeding them in some cases. So that's just your existing shows going back to what they should be. And then, yes, you have launches. And so launches can be either pure launches, adds ex nihilo, Closer Still will do some of those, or geoclones, which are the preferred route for those with strong IP and international teams. So that's one route that's a lot of the big guys like to go down, because it's less risky, of course. The third impact, which is a contributory impact, not the most important, is also inflation. So pricing inflation. So catching up on lots of cost inflation throughout COVID. Not all organizers were in a position to actually reflect that in their square meter pricing or square foot pricing immediately. So you have a lag of 6, 12, 18 months. And so we saw some of that come through again in 2023. So expect that to calm down quite substantially this year.
Oh, that's a great point. Exhibit space pricing stagnant as we were coming out of the pandemic, but probably caught up with increased costs due to inflation, and show organizers were able to increase prices on net square footage and net square meters.
Exactly. The organizers are in a strong position in the value chain, so price squeezes are not for them. They'll pass that on to the exhibitors. So they're very fortunate to be in that position. So generally that's the case, especially if you have a strong event and strong IP, then you're able to do that.
So that contributed to some of the revenue increases across the board, across the top 20, but maybe that might be slowing down going
Yes.
or for 2024.
Yes.
Okay. You mentioned 7 organizers just outside the top 20. What are the key moves or trends? I'm not sure what's going on with my camera, that we should watch from these companies. Could any of them potentially break into the top tier? I think obviously the answer is yes, with Essential going out of the top 20. So at least one spot open.
Yeah, so there's that, but there's also, I think Florent mentioned it at the beginning, the difference in revenue between that bracket is much smaller. So there's a propensity or probability for a lot of much more movement amongst those, regardless of strategies undertaken. That being said, really similar to other organizers, it's a combination of different things. It can be either like intentionally organic or M&A-led growth, implementation of new value creation strategies. And so it's it can be different things. I know that IG has been very vocal about expanding internationally and has done a few acquisitions going in that direction. We could expect this to continue. Similar with Terrapin, I think they pride themselves for being the last large global private organizer out there. To be seen if that continues. I think that there are rumors that there could be a change in ownership structure there. Yeah, there's strategy moves, but then there's also potential changes in ownerships, which by extension could also provide changes in strategic directions.
Any other ones on the Florent? Any other ones on the list that on that top 7 that you're watching closely, or can you provide any insight from your perspective on that?
Not much more like Carole said. I don't have the list there in front of my eyes, but those are the major factors. And when there's a small difference, of course, it's easy to change. So there will be new faces in the top 20 or returning faces. There's a few who have the yo effect of in and out depending on years. Yes, but it is a source of pride for some to enter the top 20. In fact, speaking to some of the smaller organizers, some of them, I won't name names, but have as a strategic objective to enter the top 20. So it's said somewhat tongue-in-cheek, of course, but it just shows the visibility that it provides and the pride that management teams have when they've broken it.
How are broader economic and geopolitical factors like inflation that we talked about? There's been supply chain issues. There's some striking going on or potential striking going on here. Global travel. How are those influencing the growth of exhibition organizer revenues from your perspective?
It can have both effects. So there is, from an organizer's perspective, there is a direct impact on prices, so on cost, but then as Florent said, it's passed on typically to exhibitors, so an impact on prices as well. But it can also have an indirect impact by the type of served markets that are tied to a specific exhibition. It can either increase or decrease demand for or participation levels for particular exhibition. So it also has an impact on participation levels. Global travel, similar from an exhibitor or visitor's perspective, it can have an impact on their willingness to travel and therefore preferring events that are closer than having to justify travel costs.
So that's the one area, right, that we haven't seen full. Domestic travel seems to be pretty back, but international travel still seems to be lagging across the board, not back to 2019 levels for international participation in trade shows, whether that's from the visitor or exhibitor perspective.
Yes, and I think that has had probably more of an impact on visitor flows, and specifically if you look at Asia and China in particular. So you have some regional dynamics. For example, we're hearing a lot that the US buyers have not come back to China, but in fact, Latin American buyers are returning in very big numbers to China events. So you're losing North America, but you're winning South America, for example. And then Chinese buyers are in lower volumes as well outside of Asia, again durably. For example, on the German global events have seen less Asia presence there. So these things are in part due to, I think, as Carole was saying, so budget considerations coming out of COVID. That is one thing. Another one's around sustainability. Another one is just simply around geopolitical movements and risks there, and trade tensions and whatever is going on between US and China, for example, around tariffs and how that impacts industry. And each show is, of course, famously victims of its served market. So if you've got less trade going on, then naturally that has an impact on your participation, whether it's exhibitor type, who's exporting or importing from where, and buyer origin, of course.
I really appreciate your time today. I just have one more question for both of you. Were there any surprises in the data? Each one of you can take that one, if you don't mind.
I think Messe Frankfurt is a bit of a question mark as to, because they've been slipping down the rankings in a way. So they used to be a clear number 3, and now they're battling to stay. They're out the podium and battling to stay in that top 5, perhaps. So that's a surprise in one way. Others who had very strong organic growth through to 23, but who, despite that, have slipped down the rankings materially. I'm thinking sort of Easy Fares, for example, because others have benefited from a return of China, for example, or some chunky M&A. So what I'm saying there is that slipping down the rankings does not correlate with poor performance. So you have to pick what's going on to say, oh, you've gone from number 14 to number 18. That does not mean that you've had a poor year. You could have had a great year, but simply others, for other reasons, have been able to accelerate their growth. But that does not characterize, the quality of your own growth.
That's helpful. Thank you. That makes total sense. Carole, what about you?
Yeah, no, I would only add it's not a surprise per se, but I was just impressed by the role of China and how much it had an impact on the reshuffling of the ranking.
That is super interesting from the organizer perspective. And when we think about the value of China, it's like the US, right? In terms of the size and scope, they're probably number 2 behind the US.
It's interesting because the US is by far the biggest market, but by a country mile. China became number 2 I don't know, 5-6 years ago or so. It overtook the UK, then France and Germany, and so became number 2, and now is a clear number 2. But I think interestingly, out of the top 20, the number of organizers who have substantial exposure to China is maybe greater than those who have substantial exposure to the US. So you got Informa, Reed, Clarin, and then when you go down the ranking, few organizers have substantial exposure to the US. In fact, many are trying to expand it in the US, whereas China has been much more open and, in a way, easy to expand into over the past 10 years. And so therefore, it has a outsized impact, as Carole was pointing out, when the market shuts down or reopens. So I guess, yeah, that is an interesting factor.
It's been so insightful to talk to you both, and I really appreciate your time and insights and experience into your top 20 list, and we're excited to share it with our readers. So thank you.
Amazing.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you for reaching out.